Hi, Amy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's fantastic to meet you.
Yeah, here we are.
We're living the Zoom life.
Yeah. I was thinking how different this is than walking into a hall and getting a feel of this campus and the people. And it's just the same thing I'm doing with everybody else.
I
It's
know, I
funny.
know.
And I was like, how different does it even, like if I do a podcast and then I go give a lecture in a hall, it feels totally
Right.
different. And now it's like, yeah, it's a little different, but it's like one thing.
Yeah, I hear you. So it's 6:30 and everyone is gathered in our virtual space here. So good evening. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's talk. My name is Amy Slagle and I'm a religion professor here at the University of Southern Mississippi. And tonight we have the second lecture of our ongoing philosophy and religion forum series, which is generously supported by the Fairchild Lecture Funds, as well as the School of Humanities here at USM. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Davis. He's an award-winning journalist, religion scholar. It's a real delight that he accepted our invitation and he's our speaker this evening. He's the author of the recent book, High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s, published by MIT Press, in which he explores the contributions of Robert Anton Wilson, Philip K. Dick, and Terence McKenna. He writes and speaks extensively on all manner of topics, but I'll say that he speaks and writes on mysticism, the intersections of technology and religion, as well as various counterculture and esoteric movements. The title of his talk this evening is Arkonology, Myth, Media, and Gnostic Conspiracy. So again, I welcome you, Dr. Davis, and I will turn the forum over to you. So thank you.
Great, Amy. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a lot of fun. I've been doing a lot of podcasts, but I haven't gotten to speak to students that often outside of the course I'm teaching at Pacifica right now and a few other events. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So I think like probably everybody listening, January 6th of this year was a particularly strange day. And I would say it was even a little stranger for me as I was watching the footage, mostly after the fact of the temporary takeover of the Capitol. And I saw a figure that we all saw. It was across the world, the image of the fellow with bare-chested, tattooed, the horns on his head, standing behind the speaker's lectern, the so-called QAnon shaman. And the QAnon shaman, or Jake Chansley, I believe he has different, they quote him with different last names, was striking for me for a few reasons. One is that if you thought of like what the average idea of who would be at the Capitol would be, you're gonna find hardcore Trump fans, maybe some white nationalists, survivalist types, hardcore Christian conservatives defending the nation, et cetera, et cetera. But you wouldn't expect to find necessarily basically a psychedelic New Ager, which is what Jake Chansley was before he became the QAnon shaman. Now, this was kind of shocking to me because if you just think about it for a minute, like whatever our religious investment as Americans, in a way, the most important religion in America is America's civic religion, or civil religion, you could call it. The idea of America plays a religious role in our country that is different than in Europe, for example, or other countries where there's different kinds of relationships between religious institutions and the state. Here we have the purported separation of church and state, but because you need some kind of thing to refer to, at least in the past when there used to be a kind of consensus reality around, I'm not so sure there is anymore, but the that it takes the form of a certain idea of American jurisprudence, American governance. And so to visually see this tattooed, pagan, horned visionary, let's call him that, in the heart of the actual chamber was a mythic event as well as a political one with reverberations on multiple dimensions. So this was shocking to me, but not altogether surprising. And I say that because over the previous year, I and a lot of people in my kind of world, as Amy mentioned, I cover a lot of countercultural, alternative religion, Bay Area culture, Burning Man, psychedelic revival. The weird stuff is basically my beat, both as a journalist and a scholar. And people in my zone, with kind of one foot in one world, or participant observers, had noted a quite noticeable, even drastic increase in the number of people in the scenes that we knew about who got into QAnon at a certain point before the pandemic, but not a lot before. 3 to 6 months before the pandemic. So suddenly, these people who were more or less, progressive, new age, into alternative healing modalities, or had done their ayahuasca circles in Peru, or went to Burning Man. This is not the Fox News listener. This is not your typical image of the alt-right or the right wing in America that was the principal holder of QAnon. Now, I'm assuming most people know about QAnon, but just in general, this is, of course, this sprawling meta-conspiracy theory, culture, movement, meme-plex that, holds, there's many things that it holds, but let's just say that there is that within the Democratic Party, there's a satanic conspiracy that involves satanic sexual abuse of children, and a variety of mind control campaigns, and that Trump is the savior against this group and the deep state that is behind it. And then there were various anticipations that Trump would win the election, and then he would come back, and then he would, throw people in jail. And that was the kind of main idea. And the way that it took, the form that it took, is that there was this mysterious figure, Q, who used a variety of different channels on the internet to drop little bits of enigmatic information that people, once they got into the culture of the thing, would analyze in order to anticipate what was actually happening behind the scenes. And this became incredibly popular, incredibly widespread around the world. It's still going. I'm not really sure exactly what's happening now. And I don't want to talk about QAnon too much, partly because I've done it so much over the last year. And so I can't really give you an update like, where are they now? Because as some people peel away, as they realize that the apocalyptic event isn't going to happen. And so therefore they were either being lied to or they were being foolish. And at the same time, there's retrenchment and the kinds of things we see in the history of religion when there's an anticipation of an apocalyptic event. The classic example is the Millerites in the 19th century, where it doesn't happen. And then what do? Well, you make another date, and then some people fall away, and some people get even more passionate about it. And something similar is happening, because in many ways, the QAnon phenomenon is religious. It's a religious phenomenon, or at least it's helpful to look at it through those lenses as well as other lenses. I do want to kind of give you like a condensed sort of my final take on how to talk about QAnon, because we have not seen the last of this. Whether or not it's a mutation of the QAnon framework that we know, or it's another kind of conspiracy theory memeplex, we will see more of this, because whether or not QAnon was engineered from the get-go to do what it did, which I think there's evidence for and evidence against, and we'll never really know. I'm pretty convinced of that. Whatever the original intention was, now people know that it works and that you can do this. So what actually happens? So I would say that it's a hard thing to talk about, like a lot of things in our world today, is they're complex. And I mean that in a deep sense, which is that a single perspective or analytic or discourse is insufficient to the phenomenon, because the phenomenon is itself sort of multiplex, working at multiple levels simultaneously for multiple people, perspectives that have different agendas. So it's like it's an assemblage rather than a cult. But though it has some kind of cult elements. So what are in that? What are the major elements of that assemblage? It's important to recognize again, because we haven't seen the last of it. One is that it's a game. It's very clear that aspects of the Q phenomenon are structured like an alternative reality game, meaning not just that there are sort of game-like elements to it. You learn how to play the game, you learn how to interpret the Q drops, you learn how to do your own research as you follow the rabbit holes to get apparent confirmation of what are fictions mostly. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I don't want to completely demean conspiracy theory, but I'll talk about that in a second. So there's a game-like quality, and even to the point of actually exploiting psychological elements that game designers use in order to get buy-in to the game. So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily be told exactly what the meaning of certain things were. You were actually invited to go and make the connections yourself so that you would have an aha moment. That's what the white rabbit means. Ah, so then you're invested in it. You're starting to play the game. It also became like a community. One of the funny things is from the outside, you look at QAnon material and you're like, oh my God, it's so dark. All they can do is talk about like, taking adrenochrome from abused children and mind control. And I mean, it's so dark. And yet the actual vibe of a lot of QAnon media is actually very sweet. Very, oh, you're joining in. And in fact, one of the reasons that so many people from the New Age participated is because there was a lot of emphasis on light. And now it is time to resist the darkness and to manifest your true being. So that's another kind of element of it. Another feature is it's sort of a prank using, or a trolling operation where the aspects of the media, of the internet, of social media, and of how YouTube videos work and how information is packaged and spread, how virality is controlled, how influencers work. All of that is kind of this new ecology that we're only just barely getting our hands on, even as it continues to change. And QAnon was both very well designed to take advantage of that ecology, and the ecology itself, once the thing got going and it was viral, started to do its own spin on the situation. Meaning that even if it was engineered as a game from the get-go, once it was going, many people could jump on. And we all know this aspect, which is another important thing to think about, which is the way that influencers work in a information ecology in which traditional sources of authority have broken down. So I no longer trust the New York Times. I no longer trust the university discourse. I don't know really what to believe. I'm watching, horror movies and reading science fiction and listening to, whatever music. And within that kind of environment, the role of the influencer, as it's a sort of self-perpetuating personality or celebrity, is a rising phenomenon across the board in YouTube, on Instagram. It's like what people do now to express themselves within the digital environment, particularly the environment of social media, is to influence. And the thing about influencing is once it works, you know how to keep it going, right? Because you got analytics, you can track it, you can see what works. So if I'm an influencer and I'm doing my thing, it's not working very well. I'm not getting that many likes. I'm not getting that many hits. And it turns out that if I start dropping QAnon stuff in there because, you know, maybe I got some concerns about the Democratic Party, or I have some questions about what's happening in Hollywood. But as soon as I start dropping the QAnon stuff, boom, hey, it's working. And then, oh wait, now I'm going to play the game. And then you start becoming part of this viral ecology, and you're just getting a lot of attention. So there's a great an invitation to everybody to come and play. And here's where the really sort of novel aspect of QAnon comes in. As I'll mention in a second, on some level, you have to see QAnon as just the latest iteration of centuries of what we call, somewhat unfairly and problematically, conspiracy theory. And if you're someone like me and you sort of know this history, you've read many things, you've seen through the 20th century, through the 19th century, the Anti-Masonic Society, the John Birch Society, the Progressive Party, satanic ritual abuse, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of stuff there. You see that, like, in a way, QAnon is like, oh, okay, so it's sort of like they're bringing some of this in and some of that in, and the amalgamation of different stories is part of what conspiracy theory does. But QAnon took it way beyond. You could throw everything in there. Everything but the kitchen sink was part of QAnon. And the way the most obvious way of seeing that was the people that it included. It was a huge umbrella. And this is very hard to do now. It's very hard to unite disparate communities and worldviews. In fact, what's really mostly happening is a breakdown, where different worldviews are splintering off. We're each in our own information silos. We're not really communicating. We distrust the people next door. You know, we're down in our narrow little, micro communities. But QAnon is this big umbrella. You have, for example, conservative Christians and New Age alternative medicine people and weird survivalist, heavy metal pagan types, not unlike the QAnon shaman, and total paranoids, and racist nationalists, and hardcore anti-Semites, and environmentalists. Like, whoa, what is going on here? So the brilliance of it was that you could sort of unite it was like a meta conspiracy where all these different elements could be combined into essentially a social movement, a digital social movement that had a lot of real world power and still does. It is now part of our landscape, like a new religion. Like, oh, we have to deal with Christians. And in America now, we have to deal with lots of religions, and we really got to deal with them. We have to deal with Islamic Americans who want to practice Islam in America in their way and have agency and control over how they express themselves and what they wear, and pushing, we got it. That's America. We got to deal with it. And in a weird way, we got to deal with QAnon. It's part of the picture in this kind of religious way. So it was able to create a sprawling meta conspiracy. Now, I kind of want to stop talking about it, but I will keep talking about conspiracy theory. And I'll touch in again on this question of how did this work? What makes it resonate with so many people? So I want to pull back and just talk a little bit about conspiracy theory in general, and then I want to give a religious / Gnostic / Christian spin on some of the ways I'm thinking about why this stuff happens now and what it's responding to. So the first thing, whenever I talk about conspiracy theory, I got to lay out the caveat right away. Some conspiracies are true. There is nothing wrong intellectually, morally, aesthetically, politically for pursuing what other people call conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theory is a wastebasket term. That means if you can get your enemy's perspective into the basket, you can throw it away. So if I can convince you that the criticism of the, let's say, vaccine that I'm putting out is a conspiracy theory, then I can not deal with the actual content of the critique. And indeed, this is how the idea of the term conspiracy theory emerges in the wake of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which is really kind of the ground zero of sort of postmodern conspiracy theory. As I said, conspiracy theory goes back to, let's say, the French Revolution, because when the French Revolution came, there was this great transformation, chop the heads off the aristocrats and the king. Looks like it's, they're going to change the days of the week. It's like the first modern revolutionary moment, and reactionaries, traditionalists, monarchists freaked out, and they're like, how could this have happened? And a lot of them turned to what we would now recognize as conspiracy theory, including, yes, the bête noire, the Illuminati. This is where we first hear about the Illuminati as a secret quasi-Masonic force that is architecting some new organization of society, and thereby creating some kind of satanic or anti-Christian structure that's going to change everything and control everybody. You see where we're going. This is a motif that keeps coming up over and over again. So you have this basic problem of, okay, JFK got shot, doesn't look very, looks a little fishy there. Warren Commission, pretty fishy. If you actually look at the stuff, I think a reasonable person, if you look at the Warren Commission's account of the JFK assassination, would go, I don't think so. I mean, that's just me. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist. So when the Warren Commission comes out and said, oh, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, then he just happened to get killed by Jack Ruby, who then just happened to die, that's just a bunch of coincidences. And anybody who tells you anything else is a conspiracy theorist. So it enabled the establishment, essentially, to put anybody, journalists, concerned citizens, investigative reporters, cops, there was a lot of people who didn't buy it, and say, oh no, that's conspiracy theory. So you always got to say, every time you're talking about conspiracy theory, you recognize that it's a term of abuse, and that there are conspiracies in history, there are conspiracies in politics, and in fact, increasingly, power takes the form of conspiracy. Power hides behind the boardroom doors, makes decisions, and then has a public face. And we don't often get to see what happened behind the boardroom. I mean, it's actually a natural part of power. So that's important to acknowledge from the get-go. Another thing that's interesting about this wastebasket, though, and it's really important to think about this, because it's kind of strange. If you think about conspiracy theory as just a category for certain claims about reality, for a certain way of thinking, feverish, obsessive, paranoid, and especially associational. Like, wait, that element there, that means that this is connected to that because they have the same middle name and it happened on the same day. And didn't you realize? And so you start that kind of building of meaning in a quasi-paranoid way that's also related to religious interpretation, but we'll leave that aside for a moment, where you're kind of reading the symbolic expression of something as hiding clues of its real essence. A contemporary pop example is, if you go online, go on YouTube, you could find people, some of them only half seriously doing this, I believe, but certainly some people are serious, interpreting, R&B videos as being coded messages of Illuminati power, or the star or Super Bowl halftime shows. They analyze the symbolism. She comes in on a bull. The bull represents Marduk from the Babylon, and it's all about, that kind of stuff. And you can find that just goes on and on. Welcome to your rabbit holes. So that's another aspect of conspiracy theory, a kind of like feverish, dreamlike interpretation that no longer seems to be related to facts very much. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's already, well, what are we talking about here? Because the same category can include the following two things. A conspiracy theory includes a carefully, obsessively researched tome about, let's say, the JFK assassination, that carefully links all of these individuals who worked in anti-Castro forces and the mafia and the CIA, and connects it with like, you know, specific politics within Washington, D.C. that all eventually comes around and points a finger at certain concrete individuals, let's say in the CIA, which is where my money is, but we'll never know. And that's a conspiracy theory. And we go online, we go on a YouTube video, and it's about how there's a bloodline of aristocrats in Europe that is ultimately descended from lizard aliens from Orion, from the star system in Orion, and that they've been manipulating using mind control devices, through media. They kind of were mind controlled by these lizard alien forces. That's also a conspiracy theory associated with David Icke. Was really the first guy to really hit the kind of bring the sort of new world order, more political conspiracy into connection with alien UFO stuff. And those used to be somewhat separate in, let's say, the 1970s. Those were two separate worlds, the UFO, military secret agency collecting devices, and the new world order mind control kind of stuff was largely separate. And then they blended, because that's what these ideas do, is they blend. So both the lizard alien idea and the meticulously researched JFK assassination theory are conspiracy theories. Well, that's very interesting. That tells us that there's somewhere in our contemporary worldview where we're forced to put things in categories. There's somewhere where fact and what we can only call, let's say, what should we call it? Fiction, the fabulous, the visionary, I don't want to say delusional, that's a little too pathologizing, but let's call it the sort of mythological fables or fabulosity. And it's hard to describe, but there's a place where those two things are one thing or fit together. Well, that's so strange, because we're taught over and over to do the opposite. You put facts over here, real history, science, the science of medicine, of vaccines, of chemtrails, of whatever, and over here you put delusion and fantasy and paranoia and all that. But of course, they're intimately bound up together. And that fact that they're bound up together is incredibly frustrating for everyone on the outside, and even to some degree for the people on the inside. Because if you're the guy who wrote that 1,500-page book about the JFK assassination, someone calls you a conspiracy theorist and says, well, what are you going to talk about next? Aliens? You're like, no, I'm not talking about aliens. I'm trying to figure out how power actually works historically in our reality, et cetera, et cetera. You see the bind that people are in. So there's two kind of ways then to talk about the problem of conspiracy theory. And it is a problem, folks. It's another one of our wicked problems, because again, as someone who was tracking this my whole life, I was always interested in this stuff, and it was super marginal for the most part. I mean, yeah, there were large communities that shared some of it. There's always been a part of the American right wing or conservative people in America that have embraced, especially Christians, like apocalyptic ideas that, when we get to the end times, there's going to be a antichrist system, and the antichrist is going to take over, and the mark of the beast, and you're not going to be able to buy and sell, and that's the computer, or that's the little the UPC symbol on the back of your products, or whatever it was. That kind of sort of religious visioning of contemporary technological capitalist society, that was always there, but it's just exploded because of the internet, because of the breakdown in consensus reality, because of the breakdown in conventional authority structures, because of the increasingly weird character of contemporary life, where it just makes sense that, that on the same table that we're dealing with, vaccines and, trying to start up our economy again, we're also dealing with, conspiracies and religious ideas. It's just like it's a big mush now that we're all trying to kind of navigate. And it's certainly part of popular culture. It's just part of the field now. conspiracy theory. So the one side, so we remember we have the fact side and the religious, visionary, mythological side. And the fact side, it's like people is reflected in the people who want to like, who say that the problem with conspiracy theory is that we have to like restore respect for facts and critical thinking and science. We must inoculate ourselves and the population against these unhelpful ideas that are delusional, they're paranoid, and we have to, return to a more a culture that respects facts and science and criticism, critical thinking. Okay, sure, I buy that, but good luck. And I say that because part of the very functioning, part of the ways that people get into conspiracy theory is that they divest their trust or have their trust divested for them from these conventional sources of authority. So if the source of authority keeps on spattering on about how they should retain their authority, once you've checked out, you're not going to get back in, good luck. And so it's a bit of a crisis, but the way they tend to think of it is that the problem with conspiracy theory is a problem of bad data, bad information, badly interpreted. And if we just get people back on the train of facts, it'll get better. But that doesn't really deal with the mythological, religious, visionary side. And I guess from a secular perspective, that makes sense. If you're an ardent secularist, you think that the visionary, mythological, religious imagination is basically ultimately BS. So you're like, whatever, that's not the problem. The problem is facts and getting people back into a consensus about science and historical reality. But if you're like me and you're like, look, the human beings are, whether you want to describe it in terms of sociobiology or whether you want to invoke other dimensions of reality, I'm not going to get into it. But we are, at the very least, wired for religion or wired for these kinds of perceptions, practices, unusual experiences, hopes, beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. It's part of the picture. So that's what I want to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the fact side of how conspiracy theories work or don't work, or how they go wrong, or how do you talk to people about it. I want to talk about and focus on for the rest of the chat this religious dimension and raise some interesting points. I think I'm hopefully interesting points. And what my big question is why does this resonate so much? Just to take QAnon, although I'm not going to only talk about QAnon. Why does it resonate so much? And what exactly is resonating? So my belief in the answer to the question, how was QAnon at a time of tremendous fragmentation able to create such a big tent where all these different people could show up? And I believe it's because they threw down the major myth that animates a lot of conspiracy theory and apocalypticism and millenarian movements, particularly Christian ones. And that is a kind of apocalyptic Manichaeism that puts an absolute good against an absolute evil on the stage of history. In a way, that's what apocalypticism is, right? The book of Revelation. Satan, God, they have it out in whatever way they're having it out. It happens in time, in history, in a way that ends history and makes something else happen. Of course, there's lots of different accounts, but you get the idea. So what QAnon did is to resurrect that mythic battle inside the interstices of contemporary media culture, history, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the invocation of radical evil that provided the big tent. And that's been an element of conspiracy theory for a while, but it took a new form. And that's why the sexual abuse, the sexual ritual abuse of children is at the heart of it. And if you know the history of QAnon, you know that just before QAnon started, the previous version of the same thing was Pizzagate. The idea that these leaked texts from through, Democratic National Committee indicated some kind of pederast circles among the elite, and they were using this language of pizza to describe that. And then that kind of, led to a guy going to a pizza restaurant with an AK-47 or whatever, and luckily nobody got killed. But it showed that the thing worked, and indeed QAnon. Many people believe that then whoever started the QAnon thing saw what happened with Pizzagate and said, okay, we can do that, but we can do it better, and that's how the thing got going. Now, take a moment here. I am not saying that there are not organized elite circles of pederasts in America or the world. There are. It's clear that there are. I mean, if you just look at some of the famous names of people who've gone down for such things, it's clear that that is an aspect of elite power. But of course, people who work with abused children already knew that. And indeed, when QAnon decided that that was one of its main political gestures, was to save the children, and that was actually one of the memes that got a lot of people, particularly more women and soccer moms and people who weren't even necessarily into a lot of the stuff that the original QAnon people were, was this call to save the children. But of course, from the perspective, if you were in an NGO or an organization that was actually attempting to save the children, QAnon was the worst thing that could have happened to you. It completely distorted your work. They did a terrible job. It was this major step backward for taking care of children. So in reality, wasn't helpful. Symbolically, however, extremely helpful. Why? Because that's radical evil. That's a common denominator radical evil. An environmentalist might think that a belching coal stack is radical evil, but the Republicans who work at the plant don't think so. But most of us can pretty much agree on that one, and that's why it's at the heart of it, because it inflames it with this horror, and then that horror is sort of exploited and amplified and spread through this meta conspiracy in a way that galvanizes you to engage with it, and also provides you tremendous satisfaction at a time of very difficult negotiations that we almost make every day. What do we believe? Who's in charge? What's going on? What should I do? Is there any hope? I mean, this is a very stressful, very unusual situation that none of us are really prepared for. And so suddenly, I know now, by playing a kind of game where I can see behind the corners, that there's radical evil. And that radical evil, in turn, allows me to feel good again. I'm no longer compromised. What do I mean by compromise? Well, actually, I don't have my phone. But, you got your phone, right? And like, I just pick up your phone and call your mom, right? Well, what am I actually doing? Well, I'm picking up this, security surveillance device that was engineered with many nefarious intent, particularly to get me addicted and tracked in a variety of ways, that when it dies, goes into a trash heap, and all of the rare earth minerals that require politics and blood to actually manifest so you can make the thing, then return to the earth in a toxic manner. That's what I'm using to talk to my mom. So on some level or another, we all sense this, and that's just one example. We're all compromised. We're all stained by the system in different ways, or depending on how you think about it. But so now with QAnon, I can go, no, I'm good. I'm good. Oh, and my friends, we're good too. We're all good. We really want the light to happen. So it makes sense. It makes sense. It really does. But I want to go a little farther. And this is, so up to now, it's like, other people look at this stuff would say this. I just want to give you a final idea. And as I tend to do, I tend to go a little bit long, and I'm not going to get to a lot of the fun Gnostic details that I wanted to. But I do want to leave you this kind of final segment. I think there's something more going on there. I think that when QAnon and other conspiracy theorists tell stories about the satanic character of Bill Gates, the World Health Organization, Hollywood elites, the Democratic Party, or, you know, the Republican Party, or those Christians over there. I mean, you know, people do it all across the board. It tends to be conservative, but it's not exclusively so. And this has to do with the idea, well, what's animating in the vision, in the mythological religious imagination? What is animating these nefarious forces? Well, we could say they're demons, right? You know, it's part of the satanic system. And I'm like, okay, that's good. But there's a much better word, and a word that has been, not coincidentally, in my opinion, increasingly bandied about within conspiracy circles. And that word is archon. Now, archon, and I'm not going to go into linguistics, which I don't know particularly well, but archon just means ruler. So when we say arche, it means like form. So like an archetype is that same root word. But archon just suggests ruler. And in the more paranoid Gnostic version of this idea, and just to put it in a tiny nutshell, Gnosticism being a form or expression of Christianity and related esoteric ideas that places a particular emphasis on the world being a prison or a trap, matter, the whole thing. The only chance we got is to get out, get our spirits out of this hell realm, essentially. So it's like an extreme form of dualism or even Manichaeism, but one that uses a lot of Christian and Jewish language and literature. And the basic framework for the Gnostic idea is that the creator of this world, the material world we share, is godlike, but not the true God. He's a lower God, the demiurge, and he might be wicked, he might just be ignorant, but in any case, he created this thing that we're stuck in, but we have within ourselves a spark of the true light from the distant God. Now, there are many different kinds of Gnosticism. Some scholars don't even like to use the term because it's so complicated, but what I just said is sort of like boils down to the essence of the thing. If you've seen the Matrix movie, it's not that different. It just, instead of a weird race of aliens, it's you know, this archon system. And the controllers of this world, the world that's fallen, the world that is a trap, a prison, are called archons. And today, when you go into conspiracy discussions and you find people using the word archons, they're using it in that sense, that our world right now is being controlled by forces that aren't simply human. And you could say they're demonic, but in a way that almost misses the point, because it's really about the way in which they're rulers, they're controlling. So you get this whole language of the archons in Gnosticism. And it leads even to this sort of kind of, in a way, the first conspiracy theory. So everybody knows the story of the Garden of Eden, right? Well, how would you react if I came up to you and I said, hey, yeah, the Garden of Eden, right? But the thing you don't realize about the Garden of Eden is that Yahweh is not the true God. In fact, he's a lower demon or a lower entity, a mere demiurge. And the snake is actually bringing light to Adam and Eve so that they wake up and remember that they actually come from a higher plane and that they need to escape this prison. That's what you find in some Gnostic tractates. The snake is good. He's waking up Adam and Eve from this prison sleepness inside the Garden of Eden. That's conspiracy theory, right? I mean, that's what it's like. It's like reading against the grain. Hey, I know the secret truth. Bill Gates looks like a humanitarian, but he's actually implanting, you know, microchips in us. So that's the kind of extreme Gnostic framework that really underlies a lot of kind of conspiracy theory thinking, particularly as it relates to worldly power. That worldly power is not just human institutions, but archons, these kinds of demon-like rulers or controllers or powers. But the language of archons isn't just in the Gnostic literature that has a sort of, has a play in contemporary conspiracy discourse. It's also a widely used term in the New Testament. And this will be my last kind of point. And the work I'm going to refer to now is by a theologian named Walter Wink, who wrote a trilogy called the Powers Trilogy. And he spent like most of his work focused on the question of not just the archons, but the ideas of power in the New Testament. And he's a liberal theologian. And he faces a very interesting question, which is the same kind of thing. It's like he goes, if you read through the New Testament and follow the language very carefully, the language of power, which isn't just archons, there's a whole set of words that he talks about, and just, thrones, powers, rulers, principalities, authorities. There's a lot of different words that are used to kind of describe power, is that he noticed that in the New Testament, it's both apparently supernatural agents and worldly powers that are referred to by the same language. And so he's really thinking about this as a theologian, not just as a historian, as someone who believes in spiritual realities. And he comes up with a really fascinating conclusion that I think says a lot about what's actually going on in conspiracy theory. And the conclusion he comes to, because again, he's a liberal, he thinks that the bad things in the world are patriarchy and the mistreatment of the poor and the domination of political and economic elites, and we need to push back in a context of growing environmental crises. These are his concerns. But he's looking at these institutions and he goes, what I think is actually happening is that on the outside, it's what secular people see. There are these worldly institutions, banks, corporations, political parties, unions, whatever, and they're corrupt. They're self-serving, they lie, sometimes they do terrible things. But his theological twist was to go, but all these organizations, he's not talking about people, he's talking about organizations, systems, corporations, the non-human forms of institutional power. As he says, all of those things have a spiritual inside. They have a quality to them, something lifelike, agent-like, what we think of maybe as like corporate culture. Like that corporation is this particular corporate culture. Well, who is that? Is it the corporation? What's a corporation? It's just a bunch of legal documents and bank accounts and operations, and the humans come and go through it. And he's saying, yeah, that's it. Institutions have a spiritual dimension. They have an inside. The way that human beings, I can look at you, I look at your body, I can analyze your body, I can, put x-rays through it and interview you and get your life story, but I can't really get to your inside, but I presume there is one. And he's saying there's an inside to these institutions. And a lot of the time it's wicked. And so what some people might see as demons in the sky or from some other level of reality, Walter Wink says, no, they're here. They are the immanent insides of our institutions, which are so clearly flawed at best and actively nasty at worst, self-serving, cruel, and serving what he calls the domination system. And I don't want to go into all the politics about it. We can talk a long time. I've been talking a long time already. I'm just going to wind it up with that. And I think that part of what we see with QAnon and part of what we see with conspiracy theory and part of what we see in our own psyches as we look at the conflicts and at the conundrum of contemporary civilization and the myriad of wicked problems we're in and the seeming incapacity of people to really move the lever, is that we're looking at an archon system where we're waking up to the reality that these things do have some kind of agency, some kind of non-human play to them, that at least on a psychological or allegorical level, people are responding to. And they respond to them by projecting onto them, by thinking that they're, that Bill Gates is an evil person, or there's a satanic, all this kind of fantasy. But the core perception is that these institutions are profoundly sick, and that sickness has a spiritual quality to it. However you want to read that phrase, spiritual quality. And so Wink's final move, and I'll leave you with this, and I think I'll read one quote by him at the end that I think is pretty great. It is characteristic of the powers that, though they are established, staffed, and perpetuated by people, they are beyond merely human control. And this is true of everything we look at now. We are part of feedback mechanisms that have enormous inertial qualities to them. We're not going to control it all as human beings. It was the experience of a total system operating autonomously, and even at times malevolently, that gave rise to a perception of the role played by the powers in human destiny. For our struggle, and this is from Ephesians, for our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, the archons, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in their heavenly places. And what he's saying is that that's usually interpreted as meaning like on some other plane, there's like fallen angels, or hiding in hell, or taking over our minds. And he's saying, no. All of that stuff is just the spiritual quality of the actual institutions that we have. Fascinating perspective, because it acknowledges the power of this visionary, mythological, religious imagination as being an actual player, not just a foolish interpretation of something, but in some sense, correct recognition of the stakes and the players, albeit with a lot of paranoia and fantasy projection on top of it. And it also suggests a way out. So Wink wrote about the Gnostics, and in many ways he kind of agreed with them, because the Gnostics also had a very dark view of a worldly domination system where we're oppressed by these archons and there's hardly any room for escape. But as a theologian, he pushes back against the Manichaeism. He pushes back against the kind of paranoid excess where we're good inside and everything else is just irreparably evil. He refuses that as a Christian, because he has to affirm that however screwed up these institutions are, however evil and self-serving and lying, Wall Street is, or corporate heads are, or institutions of all kinds, the World Health Organization and their self-serving and their manipulation of data to gain power, and all the ways that institutions perform small and greater evil, that's still part of the human world, that is part of what we need to be humans on this planet right now. It's not irredeemably evil. And so it's in a way, it's a very tough burden, because it's easier to just project evil and say that system is completely corrupt. We got to tear it down. And a lot of people are calling for us to tear everything down now, right? As if something rosy is just going to magically pop up. People are much better now at tearing down and saying why everybody's, wrong and morally compromised, even evil, than building up and trying to figure out how can we actually lead? How do we deal with these leaky, broken, deeply problematic systems that seem to be the only bulwark we have against, some less desirable scenarios. So it produces a certain humility and a certain recognition that we're all part of the problem, that we are stained, that we are compromised, rather than the more apocalyptic, you know, in a way, kind of nice. It's sort of exciting, and you know, it's clarifying to believe in these kind of conspiracies or to invest in them. But I think it's more mature and more human and ultimately more spiritual to engage with the mess and to recognize that, as ever, we just kind of have to muddle forward as best we can, gathering our inspiration from the mythic imagination, from religious values and religious ways of seeing the world to some degree, but also bringing that very much into play in the world of fact, compromise, discussion, and a mutual acknowledgement that nobody really knows what's going on. So I think I'll end there. Thanks for your patience. I hope this wasn't too wacky and all over the place, but that's it. I really appreciate it, actually, because I've been talking about this stuff for a while, but not from this angle. And this has really given me an opportunity to kind of digest and collate a lot of my ideas. So again, thanks for your attention.
Eric, this has been tremendous. Thank you so much for all that you've shared, your insights, and offering all your thoughts on these pertinent topics. So you gave us a lot to think about.
Great. Well, it was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it.
We'll keep you in mind for the future.
Yeah, hope next time I can be there in person.
Yeah, we'll bring you
A lot
there.
more fun. Then we get to go out and have dinner, and, you know, hang around and chat afterwards with students and stuff. So
Absolutely. Yeah, at this point, we would have taken you to dinner, but
all right.
Thank you so much. I wish you a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you for coming.